Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday, July 8th study session of the Olympia City Council. We have one item that we will be studying this evening, and that is discussing the Olympia Police Department's use of force and crowd control policies, and also a discussion around training for our officers. And so this is a study session that was requested by council a few weeks ago, so we were able to get this scheduled pretty quickly. And I'm really pleased that we have our interim police chief, Aaron Jelsic, with us, as well as a couple sergeants from OPD, Paul Evers and Matt Rentschler. And they will be going through both of these topics. And then since it's a study session, we won't be able to accommodate public comment during this time or questions from our audience. So you can also email us or Aaron with questions after tonight's study session. And so I'm going to just, if there's no other, we do have a quorum. I think I have to acknowledge that we do have a roll call and everyone's present. And so let's go ahead and just start with Aaron.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. I'm Aaron Jelsic, for the record, the Olympia interim police chief. And I do want to thank you for allotting this time. I know it's a busy schedule for all of you, but I think this is an important topic for us to discuss. And you know, now more than ever, it's important for you and our community to better understand our use of force policies, our practices, our training, including that of crowd control and you know, how we deploy crowd control efforts and how we train regarding crowd control. I'd like to introduce two guests that are going to speak on these subjects tonight. The first is Sergeant Matt Rentschler. If we go to the next slide, Sergeant Evers is going to run the slideshow for us. Sergeant Rentschler's 18 years of service with the Olympia Police Department. He's got 13 years experience as a defensive tactics instructor and a lead instructor for the Olympia Police Department. He's a 10-year certified master defensive tactics instructor for the Criminal Justice Training Commission. He's a former OC spray instructor, which is pepper spray, and a former SWAT team member. Sergeant Evers is a 23-year veteran of the Olympia Police Department, 16 years experience as a firearms instructor and a lead instructor for the Olympia Police Department, 6 years as a certified master firearms instructor for the Criminal Justice Training Commission. He's a less lethal impact chemical munitions instructor. This has to do with crowd control munitions that he'll talk about later today. A CART team leader, which is a crowd control chemical munitions team leader. He's a crowd control instructor and a de-escalation instructor. So, you know, I share that with you because I want you to know that, you know, we value staff to be very highly trained. We have in-house instructors. And these two sergeants are well-known statewide for their capabilities, their training and experience, and as master instructors. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. The overview today, you'll hear information about our use of force policies, our use of force concepts on de-escalation training. We'll review how our employees, our current policies compare to the 8 Can't Wait campaign. If you haven't heard about that, that's the national campaign about policies that have shown to be effective in reducing uses of force if they're implemented. And we'll review crowd control training and how we do that here at the Olympia Police Department. We'll go over some information about less lethal and chemical munitions. And then we'll open that up for questions. As we go through this presentation, being that there's a lot of information, I would ask that if you have questions, feel free to ask so we don't get kind of those ideas and topics don't get lost. So, and then if you have ones you want to save to the end, we can do that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Sergeant Rentschler, who's going to start with our use of force policies.
Hello, Madam Mayor and council members. This is Sergeant Rentschler, for the record. And I'm going to kick things off by talking about the use of force policy. And what I'm going to do is give you kind of an abbreviated version of what we give all the new officers and the lateral officers that join the Olympia Police Department, let them know where we stand on use of force training and policy. So to kick things off, you should have the slide in front of you there. The Olympia Police Department policy states that personnel may use force when necessary to gain compliance with lawful directions, accomplish arrests, overcome resistance to arrest, protect persons from serious physical injury or death. I'm going to skip the RCW for a second. I'll come back to that. Or to restore or maintain discipline in the jail. Staff will only use the amount of force reasonably necessary to control or otherwise subdue individuals. And just the reference to the RCW just talks about the statutory authority for officers to use force and how that is lawful. That's why that's contained in that slide. Our use of force policy also states that protection of life is more important than the apprehension of criminal offenders or the protection of property. The responsibility to protect life includes an employee's own life. The department recognizes that the safety of innocent citizens and officers takes priority over the safety of subjects engaged in criminal or suicidal behavior. And our policy also talks about how the use of force shall be consistent with department training and follow the reasonable officer standard. Continuing on, our policy states that progressive application of force and the reasonable officer standards should be considered when making use of force decisions. And so there's a couple definitions I pull out of policy to make sure we talk about that. And these may come up again later on during the presentation or during the questions. The progressive application of force, you'll hear that every once in a while. That is a concept where it's the escalation of the use of force that's according to a pattern that correlates subject action to officer response based on a combination of logic and law. Also, you heard earlier, I talked about the reasonable officer standard, how our use of force should be in line with the reasonable officer standard. And what that is, it's a standard of professional conduct based on the philosophy that another officer with like or similar training and experience, facing like or similar circumstances, would act in the same way or use similar judgment. Our policy states that the officer's use of force decision should consider a couple of things, and we talk about this very frequently in training. Officers need to consider, what is the severity of the crime at hand? What are they investigating? Is there an immediate threat? And how much time do they have to make a decision? What is the known offender history, if any? If we already know this person, we have a history of interactions with this person. What are the levels of suspect resistance? What are the suspect's behavioral cues? And what are the number of officers and or offenders present? Officers also needed to consider the availability of other options. So I talked earlier about an immediate threat, and one of the key points for officers to consider is to the extent they believe they are facing an immediate threat. So just to define that further, an immediate threat in our policy and in training is defined as a risk of harm that is occurring or will be accomplished without delay. In other words, it's taking place right now. So when officers are facing an immediate threat, there is more leeway for them to make a quick decision. They don't have time to consider all the factors and circumstances necessarily that upon hindsight might be obvious, because they are in the middle of a situation. There is an immediate threat. There's a risk of harm that's happening. You'll also hear us at times refer to an imminent threat. The distinction is that an imminent threat is a risk of harm that is perceived as menacing or impending or proximate in nature by a reasonable officer. So in other words, it's about to occur. So again, immediate threat, it's occurring now. An imminent threat, it's about to occur. Earlier, I talked about the things that officers need to consider when they're choosing what tactic to use or how much force to use in a particular situation. One of the things I talked about was the suspect behavioral cues, or how the resistance levels. So there's really two resistant levels, or levels of resistance, that we talk about frequently in training. And they are actively resistant behavior and actively aggressive behavior. So first up on the slide, you'll see our policy defines actively resistant behavior as behavior that is behavior by a subject that is non-compliant and that involves physically evasive movements to defeat an officer's attempt at control. And this includes bracing or tensing or verbally communicating an intention to avoid being taken into or retained in custody. Actively aggressive behavior, that's an elevation of danger where the suspect is non-compliant and the behavior also involves a threat or a step towards the act of an assault, coupled with the ability to carry out the threat or the assault, which reasonably indicates an assault or injury to any person is imminent. So when we discuss these concepts with officers, we talk about actively resistant behaviors. Again, any physical behaviors that is aimed towards escaping or defeating control, whereas actively aggressive behavior is seen more as assaultive types of behavior towards the officer or others. So our use of force policy calls what I commonly refer to as the de-escalation clause. So our policy requires that we consider a couple things when safe and feasible before we use force. Policy states that when safe, under the totality of circumstances, and when time and circumstances permit, officers shall use advisements, warnings, verbal persuasion, and other tactics in order to reduce the need to use force. Officers should consider other factors, including but not limited to medical conditions, mental impairment, developmental disability, physical limitation, language barrier, drug interaction, and behavioral crisis. And continuing with our de-escalation clause, policy states that Olympia Police Department personnel who are trained in the use of other force tools may use them to de-escalate potentially violent confrontations and provide additional alternatives to the use of deadly force. Other force tools, I believe Sergeant Evers will get into a little bit later, but those are essentially, our taser, our OC spray, some of our less lethal munitions. So that's what that's referring to. Other force tools are an important component of this agency's less lethal force equipment. Officers are authorized to employ other force tools in accordance with provisions of this policy and this department's overall policy on use of force. Our de-escalation clause also states that the application of force should be adjusted appropriately as the situation stabilizes, control is gained, and the threat subsides. Our policy also requires officers render aid. Qualified medical assistance is to be summoned after force and used in the following circumstances. If a person has sustained an obvious injury, if a person complains of injury, if an employee or supervisor requests that medical treatment be provided, if a person who receives a repeated or prolonged exposure to the CEW, which is defined as 3 or more applications, or a one-time exposure of 15 seconds or more, they all need medics to respond in those situations. Continuing on, in addition to just calling for medics and seeing that there's some medical aid that's dispatched, policy requires hospital transport and hospital clearance in certain situations, such as when a person's been struck with a kinetic energy munition, anytime a person is bitten by a police service dog, or if the CEW or the taser probes are embedded in soft tissue areas such as the eyes, neck, genitals, face, or female breasts. And with regard to OC, policy requires that when a person has been directly exposed to OC, staff will take steps to decontaminate the exposed individual as soon as possible after the event in accordance with training. Continuing with the rendering aid portion of our use of force policy, following use of force incidents, officers will monitor subjects for symptoms of excited delirium. So we're required to watch and look out for things such as respiratory problems, loss of consciousness, excessive body heat, or profuse sweating, and call for qualified medical assistance if symptoms are observed. And often in the field and in training, we're calling for medical aid prior to us ever making physical contact with that person when it's safe and feasible to wait.
Sergeant, can I ask a question really quick?
Yes, sir.
Just on a couple slides ago, before you went into use of aid, there was a bullet about go back forward. So the concept of if they're trained in other uses to de-escalate. So what percentage of our officers are trained in those other de-escalation tactics versus, just their gun or just something else?
100%.
Okay, thank you.
Every officer. Yes, sir.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah, I was going to add that I can't see everybody's faces and see the PowerPoint.
Right.
So just go ahead and just, council members, just if you have a question, go ahead and just go for it.
I'm curious to ask about the respiratory problems because this is somewhat part of the controversy out there. that some people are being told that if they can speak, they're not in respiratory distress. How are you training that appears to be a problem? Because that's not actually true. So you can be in respiratory distress and still able to speak.
Right. No, I've heard that before on police videos, and I've heard that being said, and that's not how we're training. If it appears that someone is experiencing problems breathing, or if they say that they can't breathe, we believe them, and we make sure that medical aid is en route, and we make sure that we mitigate anything that's happening that we can safely to make sure that they're able to breathe.
And Matt, a good point would probably be discuss the putting them into the rescue position because of that.
Yeah, we can touch on that briefly, and then in a little bit, we're going to show you a piece of equipment that we acquired, partially because of a concern of excited delirium and people's inability to breathe and to be safely controlled. Typically, in the past, officers had to remain on top of a person who remained combative, still actively resisting, trying to stand up, trying to kick at officers, and so that creates situations sometimes where the argument was that they would not be able to effectively breathe because officers are on top of them. And so, it briefly talked about our rendering aid component. And again, just looking at, the policy, it states that we're required to monitor them for these particular issues that are associated with excited delirium, such as respiratory problems or the inability to effectively breathe. And so they're cognizant of that. They're watching for that. They're trained to respond appropriately. And in a little bit, I will show you some of the equipment that we purchased and we've trained officers in and that we've used in the field to help mitigate some of those concerns. And we have had, as recently as in the last 12 months, specific training from the fire department with regard to advanced responses to excited delirium concerns. So I think, unless there's other questions on that topic, we were at reporting requirements. Is that right? Okay. So continuing on with our policy with regard to what officers are required to report. When force is applied, officers must be able to articulate how that force was reasonable and how it conformed to the law. Officers will document use of force. Employees shall report uses of force to a supervisor as soon as practical in the following circumstances. So anytime an officer discharges a firearm, obviously, or points a firearm at a person, if they point a firearm at a person, they're required to report that. Whenever an employee deploys other force tools, and again, that's taser, OC, baton, less lethal impact munitions. Whenever an employee uses defensive tactics or takes a subject to the ground. And earlier, I don't think I defined defensive tactics, but that's essentially using hands, feet, elbows, knees. If we're striking somebody, if we're grabbing onto them and taking them to the ground, that's also a required report. Or whenever a person, as the result of any application of force, incurs an obvious injury or complains of an injury, they're required to report that, or if they require or request medical treatment. Finally, whenever a police dog bites a person, obviously there's a reporting requirement there. So what happens? When officers report force, the use of force reports are then initiated by the supervisor or the sergeant as soon as possible after the incident. The sergeant or the supervisor shall review the incident and determine if the use of force was reasonable, necessary, within policy, and whether or not any follow-up action is necessary. The review includes contributing factors and actions before and after the use of force incident. So we're not just looking at what the suspect did and what the officer did in response. We look at the decisions that led up to the use of force, the decisions the officers made with regard to their tactics, and then we look to see afterwards whether there was appropriate de-escalation and whether or not we rendered aid as we're required to do. So once the sergeant completes that initial report, all of those use of force reports go to the team lieutenant, and each use of force report is also reviewed by the defensive tactics instructor designated by the chief. That's currently myself, and I've been in that position in reviewing uses of force for probably in excess of 10 years now. So what do we do as a defensive tactics team with the uses of force reports that we review? All use of force reports are reviewed by the DT training team on a monthly basis. The instructors summarize use of force events, and they highlight any training points and lessons that are learned from that event. So we look at the whole range of the scenario. What de-escalation tactics were employed? Did the officers adequately understand the use of force concepts and the de-escalation principles that we discussed? What physical tactics or other force tools were used? Did officers make decisions and the use of force in accordance with training? Do we need to modify the way we train officers? So we're constantly looking and seeing, is there something we can do differently or something that we can do better? And do we need to examine new technologies or equipment? So as a result, just a quick example of one of the use of force reviews. I briefly mentioned earlier some equipment we purchased. We did a review and it led to a recommendation from the DT team to purchase an alternative restraint device, which is used to assist in detaining combative subjects in a manner that's less likely to result in injury to the subject. And so what I'm going to do here in a little bit, I'm going to flip this screen around. I'm going to show you a couple of instructors that we have here. We're going to demonstrate, first of all, because I know it's a hot topic, how are we training officers to handcuff people from a prone position when they're on their stomach? So how do we do that? Where do we put our knees? Where do we put weight on a combative subject or a subject that's being handcuffed in a prone position? And then I'll show you the total restraint system, or the wrap, that we have purchased and used in the field in an effort to reduce injuries to subjects as we're transporting them to jail or to the hospital. So turn this around. And can you see everything pretty well here, Paul?
Yes, Kent, would it be better if I pull down the presentation, or
Yeah, if you pull that down,
Yes.
I
Yeah,
can
if you
see.
could pull it down.
Okay, here we go. So here we have a subject that's in a prone position, and Officer Edwards is going to come over and demonstrate our prone handcuffing. And we're going to pause here for a second because I want you to take a look at his knee here. So the way we train our officers is that the knee and the weight of the officer is primarily in the upper shoulder area, kind of in the middle of the back there. And that's where he's positioned himself to try and maintain control on someone that's in a prone position before being handcuffed. I'll walk around here in this position just to kind of show everybody. Now, at a glance, or if things are or moving, or if the person on the bottom is squirming and actively resisting, you know, that could look a little bit different. The knee might shift around a little bit, but primarily this is how we're training them to control people, and this is where they're trying to maintain their balance and maintain control on top of a subject that's being handcuffed from that position. Officer Edwards is going to go ahead now and finish the handcuffing procedure, and then we'll go ahead and show you our alternative restraint device. So essentially, at this point, the first step to controlling someone who's putting them in handcuffs, we have the wrap, which I alluded to. Officer Levitt's going to assist in bringing this out, and Officer Edwards and Officer Levitt are going to apply the wrap. This is a minimum 2-officer tactic. Typically, when we use this in the field, we have 3, 4, or more people that are trying to get this equipment on, so it's a little expedited. You see Officer Levitt is first applying the restraint to the ankles. Make that nice and tight. Officer Edwards still is necessarily controlling the top portion of the subject's body because they're typically actively resisting, which is one reason why they're going in the wrap. And I'm going to pause here just for a second to just highlight the fact that when we're training officers in the use of this restraint device, that once these two pieces are applied, the ankle restraint and the leg and the knee restraint, that we can often get off of the upper shoulder or the back area of the subject. And it's still very difficult for them to kick and move and actively resist now that their knees are locked straight and their ankles are locked in. Continuing on with the rest of the restraint device.
I'm assuming
also-
this would be, you'd be using this tactic in situations where you've got someone aggressively resisting everything.
Correct. This is used for someone who is actively resisting. And and typically what we'd find is if we would get them in handcuffs and then we'd have to get them in a patrol car, before we had this restraint device, officers were often getting kicked. We've lost officers for several months to various damage to their knees and whatnot. It's very difficult to get someone that doesn't want to get into a small police car or even a larger police SUV. It's very difficult to force someone into a car, even if they're in handcuffs, without using additional force. And that always puts us in a bad position where we're now having to use additional force on someone that's already restrained in handcuffs. So this takes that problem away. But yes, to answer your question, this is for actively resisting subjects. So once in this position, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. So one of the questions or critiques that I sometimes hear from the community is around having officers needing to be armed or any of these kind of techniques is that people that like work in certain facilities, nursing, etc., don't necessarily need to have those same tactics. Can you comment on that at all? Is what you're training people to do the same or different than what people that are dealing with combative patients say are trained to do? And if there is a difference, can you talk about why?
I really can't speak to what training or what protocols that people follow in those other facilities or other settings. I could tell you that the environment is likely different. The environment in a controlled facility as opposed to working out on the street and in the elements and with a crowd and things of that nature. But I don't know. I can't speak to how those individuals are trained or how that contrasts with what we do or what we're trained to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and so just continuing on, once we have them fully in the wrap restraint device, and this is fully engaged here, you can see there's handles. The officers can now reach under the arm of the subject and grab the handles, and we can carry them, and we can slide them, believe it or not, even some of our largest officers into a police cruiser, and then transport them, or oftentimes, go ahead and put them now down. We can transfer them to a gurney if they're going to be transported by medics.
A quick question. The whole time this type of application would be used, you're monitoring for excited delirium?
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
So how do you modify it if somebody is exhibiting those symptoms?
Well, the first thing that we would do is once we can, if we get back to the original position where they didn't have the upper portion of the restraint device on there, we would roll them onto their side. Right. So the first thing would be we roll them into what's called a recovery position, where it's an easier position for them to breathe, and so that's enables the officer to get off the upper body of the individual. And other than that, other than making sure that they're in a position where they can breathe, that they aren't able to do anything else there, we'll start medics and we'll expedite based off any signs or symptoms we see with regard to excited delirium, and then medics will take over and assist and rendering any aid that's needed in the transporting.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a quick question. This demonstration, there's no active resistance going on. So I'm
Correct.
Curious about concerns with injuries either to the person or to the officer, because, it looks like that's something I could do, but if somebody was resisting, I wouldn't be able to do it. So I'm wondering about, if you could just speak to that and then also talk about training that's involved in putting this on. I assume when you're training, it's not with somebody who's passive like that.
Correct. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn this around now, and we can let Austin out of the.
Thank you, Austin.
So to answer your question, Councilmember, yeah, absolutely. When we train, we train with large officers that are strong and that are actively resisting. because we want to be realistic training that we know is effective when used in the field. And believe it or not, I was very skeptical the first time I saw a demonstration like this. I thought it wouldn't work. I thought that it would take too long, and I didn't think it was going to be effective. But I was convinced by other officers on the team, and we gave it a shot. And in my experience, we've used this a lot. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers handy, but we've used it a lot, and it's been very effective. I can tell you that injuries have absolutely been reduced because we no longer have to try and shove someone into a patrol car that's trying to kick at us and still actively resist us. It's very difficult for them to defeat the wrap, and it's just a safer restraint overall, 100%. With regard to our training, we typically train on the wrap restraint system about once a year on a typical training schedule. This year's a little awkward based on COVID and whatnot, but every new officer and every lateral officer is trained in its use before they're allowed to use the device. And then we would do refresher training on a yearly basis in combination with other types of training.
I have one question. Unless I think I spoke over to someone.
Nope.
Okay. How long has this wrap restraint been used, and has it had any complications in any other situation, city, or with any person that it was used in?
So I'm going to estimate 2 years, looking over with help the other instructors. Everyone's nodding their head, so yes. So approximately 2 years we've been using the wrap restraint device. And with regard to your second question, at the Olympia Police Department, we haven't had any problems or issues. There are times where we've, tried to put it on in unorthodox situations, such as situations where someone's already partially in a car or leaned up against the car and things like that, that sometimes made it so that it couldn't get applied perfectly in accordance with how you saw here in the training room, but it still was effective in its intended purpose, which is to prevent them from being actively resistant, combative, hurting themselves, hurting officers, and still safer transport alternative than what we were doing in the past.
So you haven't heard of any other cities or anybody having issues with them?
Oh, I'm sorry. But with regard to other cities, I have not. No, I have not. No, ma'am.
All right. Any other questions for Matt? Okay. Thank you.
Is that it for me? I think we're on to Paul.
Sorry, I'm not in charge of this one.
Are we moving on from use of force after this part and into crowd control?
Yes, well, we're going to finish up use of force and then the 8 can't wait and then towards crowd control. So
Okay.
Okay. So for the record, my name is Sergeant Paul Evers. So good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. I'm going to talk about the deadly force portion of our use of force policy. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that Olympia Police Department's deadly force policy is modeled after and is in line with the federal court cases of Tennessee versus Gardner and RCW 9A 16040, which are both in place to outline when it's constitutionally reasonable for an officer to use deadly force. So our policy says that deadly force may be employed when necessary to protect the officer and others from what he/she reasonably believes is a threat of death or serious physical injury. So that's happening right now, the immediate threat of some danger. It also goes on to say that when considering when to use deadly force to apprehend a person for the commission of a crime, an officer must have probable cause, so a reason to arrest, probable cause to believe that the suspect, if not apprehended, if they just kept running away, that they pose a threat of serious physical injury, physical harm to the officer, or threat of serious physical harm to others. So we believe that if we don't stop them, they will continue with their actions and the public or other officers will continue to be in danger. So we give a couple of examples in our policy. So among applicable circumstances are the following. When a suspect threatens a police officer or another person with a weapon or displays a weapon in a manner that could be reasonably construed as threatening, and when the officer reasonably believes the suspect is presently able to do him, her, or another serious physical harm. And it's believed that if a suspect will do serious physical harm or potentially death to a police officer, that they are more likely to do it to an average citizen. And then when there's probable cause to believe the suspect has committed a crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious physical injury or harm to a person. So under these circumstances, if it's feasible, officers should give a warning. That's if they have the time, they'll give a warning. So use of force, talk about aids, supervisors, and statements. When deadly force is used, employees present at the scene will determine if any person or property incurred injury or damage. They will request necessary qualified emergency medical assistance and request a supervisor to the scene immediately. They remain at the scene if uninjured until receiving direction from a supervisor. So they stand by and wait for a supervisor to get there if they use deadly force. When an employee uses deadly force, the employee is not required to discuss the incident with anyone other than his or her immediate supervisor and an assigned investigator. Upon arrival at the scene where use of deadly force has taken place, employees will provide information to the representative of the department needed to secure the scene, identify witnesses, and follow up and apprehend any perpetrators of the crime who may be at large or other exigent circumstances. And so that's where we get into what we call our public safety statement procedure. And it's a list of questions that we ask officers that have used deadly force to secure the scene, make sure there's no suspects outstanding, or preserve any evidence on that.
I've got a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
With I-940, we're going to have people from the community who are going to be, I'm not going to be able to articulate this very well, but people from the community who will be, I guess, commissioned to come when deadly force is used to observe and to be able to weigh in on, their observations of what happened. Would they be one of those people that an officer would be able to speak to, or would the officer not be required to speak to them?
I can answer that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're working on those protocols for I-940 currently. Currently, those citizens involved are folks that will be there simply to observe the process from start to finish. That role starts at the beginning of the incident. They'll be called out to the scene. They're designated to observe to make sure they understand how the investigation was initiated, how it's carried out. They will also be part of the entire process as it goes through the investigatory process, as well as any meetings with updates for the investigation as it goes on, as well as privy to any release of information to our community prior to that information going out. So, but as far as giving input and having conversations and those at this time, the way the Criminal Justice Training Commission has laid out those rules and from the legal perspective, they will not be involved in asking any questions or giving input as to that investigation.
Right.
I have a question. It's Jessica Bateman.
Okay.
Is there a requirement if a suspect has been fatally injured by a law enforcement officer that law enforcement officer, once that person is detained, provides or renders aid?
That the officer provides or renders aid?
Yeah.
Yes, that goes back to what Sergeant Renster spoke to earlier with any use of force. So whether it be deadly force or whether it be any use of force, that the officer should be rendering aid as within their limits and scope of their abilities and as practical. So they would take the time to make sure the scene is safe before they would move into rendering aid. But yes, they should be moving in to render aid.
So they could do something like CPR?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So again, this portion here talks about when deadly force is used, is about the supervisor responding immediately. And it basically talks about the officer, the critical the officer involved critical incident team assumes responsibility of investigation. And again, just like the chief said, that's a outside investigative. So it's not Olympia Police Department taking the lead on one of our officers using deadly force. It would be an outside agency working together with many other detectives within our group, within our area. And we are coming to in line with I-940 requirements right now. And then when an officer uses deadly force, they'll be put on a temporary administrative assignment, which could be administrative leave, where they basically are given time off and they're not at work until the investigation is complete and things are ready for them to come back, or they can be put on a desk assignment or something of that nature, or in our training division or something of that, until all the investigations have done and the chief deems that the officer is ready to go back to the road. Matt, I believe this is yours.
Okay. So I'm going to start talking about our use of force concepts and de-escalation training, which is something that we do in addition to our physical skills training. But before I do that, there was a question earlier about how the Olympia Police Department training of use of force compares to other facilities or places. And I apologize, I didn't catch the council member's name that asked that question. I think the specific example that was asked about was like in hospital settings or something of that effect. And I think to more accurately answer that question, I can tell you that when I train at the Criminal Justice Training Commission, we train with corrections officers as well as juvenile detention officers. And those individuals in the facilities often don't have, firearms certainly and other force tools to the same extent that we do as law enforcement officers in the field. And with regard to some of the physical tactics and the techniques, we use the same types of tactics and techniques. And in many jails, to include the Olympia City Jail, also use a RAP, alternative restraint device, if that answers that question. But moving on to our use of force de-escalation training, the Olympia Police Department Defensive Tactics Team provides an average of 32 hours of physical skills training each year. Officers are required to attend 8 hours per year, and this does not include other topics such as crowd control, taser or CEW training, or reality-based training scenarios, which are separate training events in and of themselves. Each physical skills training session that we provide includes a written examination during which officers are instructed and tested on their knowledge of use of force policy, case law, and de-escalation principles. So every time that we're out there practicing our defensive tactics and our physical skills, we're still going over our concepts and we're talking about de-escalation, and we're providing written examinations to make sure that people understand and can articulate those concepts. The results of those written examinations, along with our monthly use of force reviews, which I referred to earlier, help shape our future training efforts. We review those and we see what we need to do to change, if anything, with regard to how officers are answering those questions. The Olympia Police Department Defensive Tactics Team also reviews real law enforcement use of force events with officers during pre-shift briefings on a weekly basis. So in these situations, officers watch police videos, many of which are popular out there in the community, and we complete associated training that considers the following questions every time. Was the video that we watched, was that officer's use of force lawful? Was it within policy at Olympia, regardless of wherever the event occurred? If it had occurred at Olympia, was it lawful within our policy and within our training? Yes or no? We'll discuss that. We discussed whether or not in each event de-escalation was a safe and feasible option, and what de-escalation tactics were used. We review common de-escalation tactics during these weekly briefings. We talk about what post-use of force actions were properly conducted. So there was another question about rendering aid and CPR. So we discussed whether the officers in the particular use of force video we watched appropriately rendered aid, whether they did it in a timely fashion, and there's advanced training that we received with regard to that, to beyond CPR, for what that's worth. Also, we discussed during these videos what were the other tactical decision-making considerations before, during, and after the actual use of force. Since we started initiating that training program during shift briefings, OPD officers have completed more than 1,200 hours of additional use of force concepts and de-escalation training.
Sergeant Rentschler, if I may, this is Clark Gilman. Hi.
Hi.
I understand there are private outside trainings, sort of staying alive seminars that some law enforcement officers around the country take.
Yes, sir.
And sometimes those differ from a particular agency's protocols or training. Do we know, do we have policies around our officers accessing outside training in tactics? Do we record those events?
So officers can receive outside training, and something I guess I would point you to, which I discussed briefly earlier in the presentation, is that our policy requires that their force be consistent with departmental training, right? So you know, if officer decides to go on his own and pay his own money and attend a class, then that's fine. Often what they teach is not too different from what we teach, but if they teach something that violates our use of force training or policies, that's not going to fly during a use of force review, and they are required to still be consistent with our training. Also, any training event that an officer, well, officers can do what they want to on their own time. Most of them, when they attend training, there is a cost, and they will do it through the department. The department has to approve training events that officers go to, if it's on the department dime, of course.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question, Sergeant.
Yes, ma'am.
So we had a question from a constituent actually, and I just wanted to voice that regarding metrics of successful de-escalation. So do we have any data that demonstrates how often de-escalation is used and successful? And then also, do we have any metrics on how often use of force is used? And where would that information be for folks that were interested in seeing it?
So we do have that information. I don't have it here handy with me. With regard to de-escalation, what I would say is the easiest thing we could do is we document all of our uses of force. And so we also document all of our contacts with the community and our arrests. And so if you take the amount of contacts and arrests that we make and you subtract the amount of time that we use force, I would call that a successful day of de-escalation. There's no separate tracking other than that. Because every time we go to arrest somebody, there are many times where we arrest somebody where there is some resistance, and it happens on a regular basis where the tactics, the verbal persuasion, the way the officer conducts the contact has led to voluntary compliance. And that's our goal, is voluntary compliance. But there's no separate tracking mechanism for us to say that one worked, other than we didn't have to use force this time. And so that would probably be the easiest way to gather that data.
You know, to follow up on that, in our professional standards report that we put out every year, we document the number of calls for service we have, the number of arrests, the number of uses of force that we have in that professional standards report each year. The 2019 report has been delayed due to COVID and other events, but it'll be out shortly. And one of the things we're going to do is break that use of force down into types of use of force as well. So if you go to our accountability and transparency page, you can see the 2018 professional standards report is up, and you'll see the numbers of uses of force in conjunction with calls for service, arrests, and so on. So that data is out there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question too, especially as it pertains to training. And Sergeant Rensler, I just heard you talking about verbal commands or just communication in general. And
Yes,
when
ma'am.
I think of de-escalation, like, you know, that's of course what that's obviously where it would start, is how we're communicating with each other. So and I actually, you know, use of force, I in my mind, that just seems to be like an escalation because, you know, whether it's rising to meet a threat or, you know, whether it causes a threat to become escalated, though I understand that, you know, sometimes that can calm a person down if they're afraid. So I'm wondering, in terms of like the training, like before use of force is used, what kind of de-escalation are officers trained in?
So typically, and this leads back to some of our video training, where we watch events and we see how things unfolded. And in every one of these events, for the most part that we watch, obviously there is some use of force. So there's something that we can look at and see how that happened. Most of the time, officers are trained to bring additional officers with them, right? So having additional backup, having what we call a show of force sometimes, with the understanding that there are some people that might feel like they're a little bit more, they might actively resist or be combative, more likely with one officer by him or herself as opposed to 2 or 3 officers. So sometimes making sure we have that backup available will reduce the chances that someone's going to resist. So that's one tactic. We emphasize maintaining distance from people. And so just keeping that distance so that, we have time to make a decision and to think and to back up if need be, to prevent getting attacked. We talk about shielding, which is, the practice of putting, any other item or a patrol car or an object in between a person and the officer so that, again, there's a barrier so that we can't be readily attacked. And it allows for more, talking, communication, active listening, and those types of tactics, because we're less concerned, not that we're not concerned, but we're less concerned about being attacked when there's something between us. So just kind of off the top of my head, those are common things that we really drill down on and talk about, is making sure you have lots of officers there, bringing your friends, keeping your distance, and making sure you have barriers between when you can. And those are tactics aside from communication skills.
Okay, and so are those things included in the use of force training, and particularly with communication skills? I mean, as a society, we learn new things frequently about how to better communicate with people. So is that a part of regular training for the officers?
Yeah, I would say that not every video lends itself to that type of a conversation, but it's fairly frequent when we do our video briefing trainings once a week that we can see examples of effective and ineffective communication styles. And so we see that and we see those examples on a regular basis.
One of the things that we do is we have 2 types of training. We do reality-based training where we place actors into situations and have the officers respond. And if the officers are using their de-escalation skills and asking the right questions and using the right techniques, the result will wind up being no force being used. We also have what we call a virtuous system, which is a video system where, again, the officers, if they use the right tactics and the right communication skills, it results in no force used. And so not every training that we do results in us shooting somebody, taking somebody down. There's a lot of times where if our guys do what they should be doing, it will result in a calm, orderly arrest or taking somebody into custody because they're a danger to themselves or something of that nature.
Sergeant Evers, to respond a little bit more to Councilmember Madrone's question, could you briefly describe the de-escalation and impartial bias training, the 40-hour institute or whatever that officers went through?
Kind of lost you there.
Oh, I froze up at the.
Oh, you're back now. So I'm not sure where the 40-hour that you're talking.
The de-escalation and impartial bias that was trained down at the ESD in Tumwater.
Implicit bias?
I did not attend that training. I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about. We go through CIT training on how to deal with different mentally ill persons and things of that nature. And we use a lot of de-escalation skills during that. It's an initial 40-hour course for that, and then we have follow-up trainings throughout the years. And I know the CJTC is implementing more and more de-escalation training through the Criminal Justice Training Academy.
And Councilmember Gilman, you're talking about the implicit bias training that we went through following the ad hoc committee. The implicit bias training is one in which focuses in on recognizing your own implicit bias when you make contact with individuals, recognizing that internally, so that your reaction to folks that you come in contact in the field, you understand potentially why you may think the way you think. It's just recognizing that bias. That training was widespread, and we continue to follow up on that training. Matter of fact, that's on the roster for 21 because we have a lot of new officers that have not been through that. But I think you're referring to the implicit bias training that we put on several years ago.
Thanks.
Can I ask a follow-up on that just to make sure I understand, Chief? So you can go on the streets without having implicit bias training in the city of Olympia?
They get, I believe they get some of that in the academy, but the follow-up training to that would be the longer, more extensive training that we have. We have in-house instructors in implicit, explicit bias training. We have in-house instructors for procedural justice training, and we have in-house instructors for Blue Courage. So all of those, there are overlap in those subjects. Procedural justice being, making sure that we treat all people with equity and respect and dignity. The implicit bias training obviously is recognizing those internal biases. And the Blue Courage training is the training in which it really is a grounding of those individuals who got into public service and reminding them, why did you get into this? It's to serve people. And so that's the whole basis of those three trainings, and they kind of all overlap. But we have instructors in all of those disciplines, and each year or every so often they update and bring a new version of that training in, and we send folks out to get updated so we can update our staff in those different training areas.
Can I ask one more follow-up? Oh, sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
Well, just help me understand though, a new recruit. So you're with another officer for some period of time until you've had all of those in-house trainings, or you get released to go out on your own sometimes before that?
The Criminal Justice Training Academy, and I think Sergeant Evers can give you a little bit more about that because he instructed up there up until recently. But the Criminal Justice Training Center touches on each one of those topics in the academy to prepare. Each agency then either some do and some don't provide that level of
so they get the 101 in academy, and then and within
correct.
the first year or two they'll get the 201 or whatever here.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
I think one
So
thing.
that sort of goes, I was just going to ask real quick before you get going, can we get what they're getting in the academy for implicit bias and de-escalation? Just get you don't have to answer it now, how many hours they're getting and what they're receiving in the academy?
Like a syllabus or just an overview, Lisa?
Just an overview, what this looks like, because they're coming out of the academy, and if they're going on the street, it would be nice to know what they have
Sure.
as their base ground level training in this. And you could just send it to us later. It doesn't have to be.
Sure, you bet.
I have a question too, Councilmember Bateman. So I'm assuming, and I know we do, that the academy training that they receive is one thing, but then once they come to us, we invest in the Olympia way of policing and do training ourselves, correct?
Correct.
So I guess, I'm assuming that at the academy, the implicit bias training is a very high level. And if we were to compare that to the amount of hours and training that they're getting in other technical things, that it's going to be very modest in comparison. So I'm curious to see how much that's actually occurring there, but also wondering why we wouldn't invest in our police officers to have that training here in Olympia to do it our way, and that would be a requirement, especially considering the comments we just made about proactively, de-escalating and anything that we can do to change those circumstances to reduce use of force and also foster safety for our law enforcement officers and the public. And it seems like that would be a crucial piece that we would want to invest in here.
Yeah, I totally understand where you're at, ma'am. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that there are hundreds, if not 1,000 different topics that police officers train on, and trying to find the time, and it's not an excuse, but it's a fact, trying to find the time to train officers may take years to get just about everything trained into them before they actually become proficient at things, because we train one day a month in the Olympia Police Department, and myself in working with the Criminal Justice Training Commission can tell you that we far exceed the normal amount of training most agencies receive in the state of Washington with our schedule. So we're talking, we receive 12 training days a year. And so with all the different topics that we're required to train, and then adding in these extra topics, it gets tough. And so unfortunately, some things do get watered down, and hopefully we are putting priorities in the right spot. So it's not an excuse, but it is a
I hear
factor.
you, and I get it. I guess, could you help me understand, this has kind of been an enigma to me as a council member, what the academy, for some reason I had the assumption that we had more involvement in the training that's received at the academy. Is that state level? We don't create that syllabus. We can't, it's all just what's required at the state level. We don't have any influence. So all police officers are getting that training. It's not specific to us.
Correct. They receive 720 hours of training at the state level, but that's a state curriculum. Now, the state does take input from their stakeholders, being all the different agencies, to develop the curriculum, but it's not solely tailored to one agency or another. So unfortunately, it's more of a in the middle of the road kind of training,
So
and
then
then we have to build on that.
So they get that training, and how long is it?
The entire academy is 720 hours.
Okay.
So what's that? Almost 4 months.
And then they come to Olympia, and then they are with a partner.
Correct. They come to Olympia. They come to me. I'm a PTO coordinator, the police training officer coordinator, and then I put them through a 1 month training between going to the academy and after they get from the academy, and they're assigned to a police training officer. They'll be average amount of time with a police training officer is usually 12 to 16 weeks that they're with a one-on-one instructor with a police training officer that are teaching them the basics of being a police officer.
And do they get courses during that time and training other than just going out and being a part, like going in the field, but do they get actual training during that time?
We have some mandatory training we put them through, but more of it is the high liabilities, the deadly force, the DT, the emergency vehicle driving, and then the officers in the vehicles should be training them one-on-one, but it's not a standardized curriculum. It's as they attend or handle calls, then the officers will assist them through handling that call, and by doing, they learn.
So if we wanted to add implicit bias training to that initial training that they receive once they do come here, that would be something that we could do.
Yeah, we can do that. Yes, for sure. One of the things that we try to do is get that training up annually. To get all officers trained annually, it's best to do it on one of those training days. We had that scheduled, but COVID interrupted those training days this year for implicit bias, to get all of folks updated with implicit bias and procedural justice. But I would agree with you. It is absolutely a priority. Those are key training topics that we're dedicated to making sure that we have our officers go through on an annual basis.
I don't want to belabor the point here. It seems to me like it would be really important to have that initially when you come on. And I can understand kind of the economies of scale of wanting to get as many officers in one room to get a training annually as possible. But I know we also have things like video tutorials, and I'm assuming if they're coming in and getting it, to me, if they're getting a use of force training once they come to our police department, they absolutely have to be getting an implicit bias training at the same time. Those two things should be juxtapositioned with each other. So,
sure. Yep, that's great input, and I appreciate that. And I think that's something we'll look into. I appreciate that.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
So cut and dry, are we required to use the state academy, and are there any departments or groups of departments that have created their own academy?
We are required to use the state academy because they certify officers for peace officer status in the state of Washington. They
can't delegate that authority.
Seattle PD has run an academy before, but they have to use the curriculum from the Criminal Justice Training Commission.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. If we're good, we're going to move on to police reform topics. So there are various varying topics circulating regarding police reform out there. And so the one we are going to address today is the 8can'twait.org. And we're going to go with a comparison of how Olympia Police Department compares to 8 Can't Wait. And I apologize, I got somebody vacuuming outside my door right now, so if I get a little noisy here. So the first topic is banning chokeholds. So Matt, if you could take this one.
Yeah, this is going to be pretty quick, and I'll read the policy to you. But we haven't had any sort of neck restraint hold authorized in the Olympia Police Department in the entire 18 years I've been here, and I think a couple years prior to that. Specifically, policy designates any sort of neck restraint, chokehold, stranglehold as an unauthorized practice. It states specifically unauthorized weapons and force tools should not be carried or used by department employees in the course of performing their duties. And the following practices and tools are unauthorized, except in an extreme circumstance, as described in the previous portion of the policy. And then listed underneath those, we've just highlighted the use of carotid restraint holds and or lateral vascular neck restraint holds. And the next topic, requiring de-escalation. You've seen this information before on slides 11 and 12. They're here again for you. But with regard to that topic, that police departments should require de-escalation, that is something that hopefully I've been able to communicate to you that that is a requirement in policy and in training and in practice.
So I'll take this one, requiring warning before shooting. And as you saw through Tennessee versus Garner, RCW 9A1604, and our policy, that they all state that when feasible, a warning should be given before the use of deadly force.
Requiring, let's see, oh yes, the requirement that you exhaust all alternatives before shooting. So OPD requires de-escalation, as we've talked about, and the use of less lethal options when safe and feasible, and to use force when reasonably necessary while balancing the priorities of life. To require officers to exhaust all alternatives before using deadly force may result in jeopardizing the safety of officers and innocent citizens in situations where they're faced with an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury. And just to touch back on immediate and the distinction that we made when we pulled out of the policy and talked about it, that's the event that's happening now. So if officers are faced with an immediate threat that's happening now where they believe someone is facing death or serious bodily injury, that would be pretty difficult to accomplish, exhausting all other alternatives before shooting. Moving on to the duty to intervene. We haven't touched on this yet, but policy does require officers to intervene in situations where they believe another officer is using excessive force or committing a constitutional violation. So specifically from the policy, every officer is required by virtue of his or her position as a peace officer to intervene in any situation where he or she reasonably believes another officer is making an unjustifiable arrest, using excessive force, or committing any constitutional violation. When a reasonable opportunity exists for doing so, officers shall intervene in such instances and prevent harm from occurring. The required intervention may take the form of one or both of the following actions. Number one being strongly cautioning the officer, or number two, physically restraining the other officer and immediately reporting the incident to the on-duty supervisor without delay. And so reporting it to the supervisor is a requirement either way, but the officers have the option of either strongly cautioning or physically restraining the other officer.
Sergeant, this is Councilmember Bateman again. I have a question about that.
I did
Yes,
too.
ma'am.
Okay, it's actually from a constituent. Thank you. So do we have any data on how often this occurs where a police officer actually intervenes in a situation like this? Is that included in the accountability or the professional standards report?
Go ahead, Chief.
I don't believe you'll find that in the professional standards report. Matt, do you know if that's anywhere else in our data?
That's where I would guess it would be at.
Yeah, I don't know that we track the intervention pieces. It's not uncommon to have two officers at a call, and one of them is not successful in communicating, the other one takes over. But as far as folks intervening, I don't know that we track that because I can't think of any occurrences when that's happened. Matt, do you have anything in your?
Well, it's not only the intervene, it's believe, or don't they have to report? So if an officer believes that another officer engaged in an unjustifiable arrest or use excessive force, and they have the obligation to report or intervene, where does that information go?
That would be if you had an officer that was outside of policy for use of force, and this is what this pertains to in the intervention, that would exist in the form of an internal investigation. It would exist in that sense, it would exist in the professional standards database as a internal investigation.
Okay.
Those would be initiated internally. It wouldn't necessarily come from an outside source. And if you look at our internal investigations or our professional standards report, you'll see that the majority of our IAs or internal investigations are internally generated. So that means a supervisor or another officer, but a supervisor witnessed or saw something that was outside of policy and addressed that. And so you'll see that. And in that professional standards report, each one of those internal investigations, there's a description of what that investigation was for. Okay. And so it's fairly revealing.
Thank you.
I've got a question. Can I go?
Yep.
Excellent. Couple things, kind of semi off topic, but something I'd like some clarification on is when best practices are for 2 officers to respond versus 1 officer. And is there really any case where only 1 officer should be engaged in, following a suspect where there's not anybody else that can see what's going on? Also curious about the, I guess, with the duty to intervene, what happened with the George Floyd case we're hearing is that was a senior officer or sergeant that was applying the deadly use of force, and the officers that reported to him didn't feel like they could call him out. So how do we deal with that? And then is there any kind of whistleblower policies within the department that if somebody subordinate to a supervisor, is there protection for them if they do call out a senior officer?
Did you want to answer that, Chief?
Yeah, regarding whistleblower policies, the reality is if we have a situation in which, we absolutely hold our employees to the highest standard. Our expectation is that we carry out the duties to ensure that all folks are treated with dignity and respect. That is a standard here that we would not tolerate that. Our employees would not tolerate that type of behavior. It would not be looked upon as within the agency. We do not have a culture that exists that would shun anybody that would report that type of behavior and that type of misconduct. I'm proud to say that we have an agency that stands for those values. And so that being said, I would expect that if we had a situation like that in which an employee came forward, you would hear about that. If there was a significant policy violation, there would be an internal investigation and we would follow through with disciplinary action. And as far as your first question about whether or not we have employees that respond to calls alone, sometimes we don't have the opportunity to wait given the circumstances. And I think Sergeant Rensher can go into this from a.
You froze, Aaron. You froze, Chief.
Let me try on that one. So when officers respond, it depends if the type of call. Sometimes they're clear calls where they're not a high red flag where there's a belief that there would be use of force and stuff. It's an officer's discretion on whether or not they're going to be handling it alone, or if they're going to have a cover officer, is what we call the backup officer, on it. And so, but those are out of all the calls that we have out there, most of the time those are phone details where we call people on the phone, or there's civil matters, things of that nature. That's when an officer would respond by themselves. If there's a thought that this may become physical in any way, or an arrest might be made, then we want to have a cover officer with them, because if you're going to restrict somebody's freedom, then there's a high likelihood that the person that you're dealing with may become combative.
Thank you. And I think we've got Danny had a question too.
Yeah, I've heard of other cities developing a memorandum of understanding with neighboring departments or those who would provide mutual aid around duty to intervene. Is there anything like that between Olympia, Lacey Tumwater, and the sheriff's office in terms of if they see an officer from another department doing something that needs to have intervention, or vice versa?
That might have to wait till the chief comes back online, because our mutual aid agreement with the other agencies, I'm not that versed into that portion of it. So.
Okay, I'll just put a pin in that one till he comes back.
Okay. We'll go ahead and move to.
Can I add something just real quick to the mayor's question? This is Jay. We do have a citywide policy 22 that provides whistleblower protections. So there is a citywide policy that protects whistleblowers that we have.
Thank you.
So we'll move forward on banning shooting from moving vehicles. So as we discussed, General Order 145, unauthorized practices, except in extreme circumstances, we do not allow discharging a firearm at or from a moving vehicle. And so, again, that would be an extreme circumstance that would occur. Other than that, it's not authorized. And then Matt, this would be yours for the continuum.
Okay, and before I will get to this slide regarding the use of force continuum, but before we do, there was a question about the use of the RAP, the alternate restraint device, and some of the instructors in the room did some quick number crunching, and I can tell you, since it's been in effect for approximately 2 years, there's been at least 30 applications and no additional injuries or issues during those applications of the RAP restraint device. That's going to be a low estimate based off of the manner in which they had to try and collect some of that data, but we wanted to give you some sort of a response since we weren't able to do that originally. So moving on, regarding the thought that police departments should require use of force continuum. The defensive tactics team continues to use the use of force continuum as a training guideline, but policy doesn't require strict adherence to a continuum. Specifically, it was removed, I think, in 2017 during a revision based off a concern that the use of force continuums do not reflect the legal standard by which officers' actions are going to be judged and may lead to using more or less force than is reasonable. So, for example, the continuum has a set of suspect actions. If they're actively resistant, if they're actively aggressive, and I've talked about some of those things and what they mean, if they're using deadly force, and then they have a prescribed set of responses the officer could use. So they would kind of balance these out. So if a suspect is actively resisting and trying to defeat an officer's attempts to control, well, then the officer could do an armbar and take the person to the ground, or they could use some pain compliance techniques, and then so on and so forth as you look through the continuum. The issue that we had, again, in that this didn't reflect the legal standard, is that depending on the totality of the circumstances of that event, the continuum might not reflect what's reasonable. So in the example I gave where someone's actively resisting and trying to pull away from an officer, and the continuum says that they can execute an armbar, that might be fine and well, but if it's a very small, juvenile suspect and you have a very large officer and they conduct an armbar, then that's an example where perhaps that was an unreasonable amount of force based off size mismatch, which is one of many factors that we talk about. So while we do use a force continuum as a training guideline, and there is some policy language about having a progressive application of force, which I discussed previously in slide 7, it's not in policy because it becomes problematic with regard to that concern of either using less or more force than is reasonable if you follow a strict continuum. think that does it for me. Nope, maybe not. Do I have this, Paul? I'll take it.
I
Requiring-
think you covered it pretty well, earlier, Matt.
Yeah, I think previous slides, we've already discussed it. The Olympia Police Department requires pretty comprehensive reporting with regard to use of force. And we don't just require documentation, we review it, we look at it, and we critically analyze that information. So that's all I've got.
So as you can see, for the can't wait, we're pretty on top of it. And we've been doing most of this for multiple years before these topics started coming up. And so I'm actually pretty proud of our agency in where we are in that. Any questions on this?
Yes, before you move on, Sergeant Evers, I just want to comment that the 8 can't wait are good tools for being better at the job as it's described today, for lessening the risk of serious injury to either the officer or the subject. But I don't think these are tools to address the issue of the experience of a person of color, an indigenous person, getting pulled over and being concerned that there's a greater risk of things escalating on a one-on-one traffic stop. Or I think that this is reform about being less likely to kill somebody as part of an interaction, but I think there are other measures we'll need to take to really get to unbiased, impartial policing.
I don't disagree that there's going to be a lot of conversation that needs to be had and a lot of looks from different angles. This right now is just probably the most, I guess, popular topic that's out there. We wanted to address it for you to show you where we stand at this point now. And I'm sure that we'll probably be having further discussions in the future of how we can do things better, because like always, we can always do things better.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Okay. So we're gonna move forward on to crowd control. So what you're gonna see in these slides is from the crowd control training that we actually provide to our officers. I've kind of pared it down because of the amount of time that we have, and hopefully I got the topics covered that you guys would like to address on it. So this is the actual slides that our officers see. So the purpose of crowd control training is to prepare personnel to deal with large crowds and riotous behavior through the use of conventional police tactics. Students should have an expectation upon completion of the course, the students will be able to successfully employ crowd control management formations, arrest teams, and use force during the events. So some of the considerations and topics, and we're not addressing all of these just because of the time we have. We talk about definitions of what civil disturbances are. We talk about our deployment guidelines and how we deploy. We address legal authority and policies. We talk about tactical formations and how we are going to actually move in towards crowds, and then how we actually do mass arrest if we were going to arrest multiple people. And again, we're not going to address every one of those topics just because of the time that we have, but if you have questions, feel free. So some of the definitions that we try to impart to our officers is what is civil disorder. So civil disobedience, we define as the refusal to obey laws in an effort to effect change in government policy or legislation. Now, protest is usually an organized demonstration of disapproval. And this is where they work with us, and then we can help facilitate that. Now, a civil disturbance is when a group commits an act of violence or disorder prejudicial to law or order. And so that's where we start talking more. And then the term riot is a violent disturbance of public peace by a statutory defined number of people, which in Washington, the statutory number of defined people is 3. And then when they assemble for a common purpose on that. So now an unlawful assembly is a meeting of a set number of people, again, 3 or more, as described by state law, who intend to either commit a violent crime or to carry out an unlawful act that would constitute a breach of peace. OPD defines violent crime as assaults. Unlawful acts and breach of peace is where we get into the property damage, the prolonged blocking of intersections, things of that nature. So we use those definitions for our officers to help them determine whether an assembly is lawful or if it's unlawful. It will also help them determine if the event is violent or non-violent. So these distinctions are what dictate what tactics we use, and I'll tell you about our tactics here in a second. So using that information, we develop our deployment guidelines. So if an event is non-violent, lawful protest, our goal is to manage that, okay? And how we do that is our goal is to safeguard the public's fundamental rights to free speech and to peacefully assemble. So we'll direct traffic and monitor and assess the crowd's behavior. So what our personnel will do is we usually assign and equip them in normal patrol uniforms, so just their daily uniforms. We'll have bicycle officers out helping us monitor the crowd, helping with traffic control. We'll have patrol vehicles out blocking the streets, so if they decide to march, that they can do it safely. And we'll have a crowd control team staging somewhere nearby in case it turns one direction or another. And then we'll have the CART team, which is the riot control munitions, typically in a vehicle that is mobile, but staging out of the area. Now, if it's a non-violent lawful protest that's infiltrated by troublemakers, we use troublemakers as a generic term. Our goal is to isolate, arrest, and remove the individual law violators as quickly as we possibly can. So that we can safeguard the public fundamental rights to free speech and peacefully assemble. That's our whole goal, is to allow people to do that. And we provide the traffic control, and we continue to monitor and assess the crowd. So again, if it's nonviolent lawful protest with some troublemakers, our assignments and equipment will be normal patrol officers in uniforms, bicycle officers, patrol cars for traffic control, with the crowd control and the CART team staging nearby.
I've got a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
So with the definition of a riot, 3 or more people involved in, violence or disturbing the peace, I think. Criminal mischief, yeah, according to the RCW.
Riot's an older term that we just recently changed.
Yeah. So if you have a crowd of 100 people and there's 3 people within that crowd engaging in criminal mischief, is the whole thing considered a riot?
No, that's where you come back to this topic that we have up on the screen right now, which is as long as it's nonviolent lawful protests infiltrated by troublemakers, then this is our standard that we try to go by here. We try to isolate and arrest those or remove those individuals from that crowd if we can safely do it. That's our number one consideration we have to take is, are we going to get our officers or anybody else hurt if we have to penetrate deep into the crowd to try to get a few troublemakers out of there? So there's a lot of times we have to wait for them to come to the fringes of the crowd for us to get them, because it would look bad. It would be bad for people that we might knock down if we had to send officers deep into a crowd to try to get somebody. So we're always weighing that. Can we safely get to them? That whole risk versus reward kind of thing. Okay. So
maybe you'll get into this in in the next couple of slides, but I'm curious at the point that a protest infiltrated by troublemakers is seen as shifting into I guess mass criminal mischief, if we're not using the term riot.
Right. So if I don't answer that question, bring it back up, and then we'll see what best we can do for you. Okay. All right. So so we get into the non-violent unlawful protests, such as a sit-in. So say that somebody comes, they want to take over the main intersection of 4th and Capitol or something like that. Again, we're going to provide traffic control. It will be deemed an unlawful assembly because it's blocking the roadway, and we have a history in Olympia for allowing these to go for quite a while before we start taking action, because we have a lot of routes that we can reroute people to. So once it's just determined that this becomes an unlawful assembly, that's when we'll start giving dispersal orders, telling the crowd that what they're doing is illegal and that they need to move. And if they don't move, they will be subject to arrest, and we'll tell them what criminal charge that we will arrest them for. Then we'll wait, give them time to actually leave, or people who are just observing, give them the time to get out of the area. And then we'll make the dispersal orders a couple times before we go in. Then at that point, we will go in and disperse the crowd with the crowd control team and possibly make a mass arrest if we have anybody who becomes defiant and decides, I want to go to jail, which happens pretty frequently. Somebody will just sit down and say, I want to go to jail. And so that's where we make the mass arrest. So if it's a sit-in passive one, then we're going to be in normal patrol uniforms with the bike officers, patrol cars for traffic control. The crowd control team will then come in, conduct the mass arrest, and the CART team will be on their fringes providing support in case it becomes violent. And they're always monitoring the crowd to make sure that there's not somebody in there that's going to want to do ill will. So, overview of civil disorders. So the crowd monitoring, we have a crowd monitoring team. Their goal is to attempt to control. And if it becomes to a point where we believe that we need to get into what we call our hard gear, which is our helmets and our hard plastic shells and protective armor, they will then leave the area and don their equipment. The CART team attempts to prevent assaults and property damage. So this is where the crowd becomes more into breaking the windows and assaulting personnel or people nearby and stuff. And so the CART team will try to prevent those as much as we can, and they protect the crowd management team and the crowd control team. So the crowd control team, once they're geared up and it's made a decision to move this protest or this disturbance out of a intersection or area, they'll set up a skirmish line. They'll give the dispersal orders, give everybody a chance to leave, and then that's when they will actually disperse the crowd and make mass arrests if they need to.
What about if there are counter protesters who are assaulting the protesters, which is something that I think we saw on video a couple weeks ago downtown? So what's the case there where it is violent, there's assaults happening on demonstrators?
I will be perfectly honest with you. The Olympia Police Department makes no distinction between protesters, counter protesters. Any group that wants to be out there and be heard peacefully can do so. Any group that goes out there and causes damage, destruction, or hurts people draws our attention and causes us to have to react, whether it be the protesters or counter protesters. In layman's term, we treat everybody the same on that. And so we're there to keep it so that anybody can peacefully air their grievances and say what they want to say. But if anybody becomes violent, then that takes us into action, and we'll have to deal with whatever group is doing whatever actions that cause us to do it. Does that make sense? So again,
Yeah.
Dispersal orders, we give people plenty of time. We try to make sure that they're heard. We use a megaphone, or we use the PA system over a vehicle, and then we give time for people to leave, and we try to warn the bystanders of the actions that could be taken, so that people who are merely watching, because we know that a lot of protests draw a crowd that want to see what's going on, and so we try to give everybody ample time to leave the area, and we try to give them different paths or avenues to leave. So we never try to block them in. We always want them to leave and peacefully go themselves. So, questions about crowd control?
I have a quick one, Paul, just in that, because it says to record. So is there a time when we bring out our PIO or a training officer to tape the incident so that we can use it for good or bad later to evaluate the situation?
It depends on when we have, not usually the PIO, but usually our detectives unit will come out with videotapes and stuff. And 2017, we had that in the crowd and things. We'll try to videotape as much as we can. We'll use the surveillance surround the city hall as much as we can, since this tends to draw a lot of attention here. So we'll use that quite often. But if we can embed some type of video system to record the actions of everybody from the crowd to our officers, we try to do that. A lot of times, though, it becomes a staffing issue. It becomes a time issue of getting the personnel here in a timely manner. Because sometimes some of these pop up so quick that our officers, we have to pull them off the road from what they're doing, and they have to drop all their calls and they have to come in and deal with this, and we don't have the time to appropriately get somebody to do that.
Thank you.
I've got some questions.
Yes, ma'am.
So I asked the question previously, and I didn't see it addressed in the slide. So like, at what point is a crowd considered to have turned into a, I'm just going to say riot, because that's what I've been saying. Like, at what point is there like so many people in the crowd that are considered violent that the whole crowd has to be acted upon?
So what'll happen? So what has happened is that if we deem that it's an unlawful assembly and it's the criminal mischief, that we will set our skirmish lines, we'll give our dispersal orders, and we'll give everybody a chance to leave. There will come a point to where we need to now clear the intersection or clear the area where we'll start pushing people back, and we'll start moving our line forward and trying to get people to leave. Our belief is that by giving the dispersal order many times and giving plenty of time for people to leave, anybody who stays is choosing to willfully to break the law, and they're doing a crime of what we call failure to disperse. Okay, and so now we have a probable cause to place them under arrest. Now, when it comes time that we use force against them and we start using cart munitions and stuff, is whatever they take to us. So when we start receiving the rocks and the bottles and all the different things like that, is when we have to respond with the munitions. Unfortunately, are there people that are there to just observe that get caught into it? Yeah, there's probably are, you know what I mean? But that's why we give the dispersal orders and the time for them to clear the area, so that they're not, we should not be dealing with them. Whether they choose to stay, then they're making a choice.
Is there ever a time where a dispersal order is given without time for people to leave?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I go to that, Paul, once? If you know that in most of these scenarios, if these things kick off really quickly and can be very violent very quickly, many of these groups are fairly unpredictable. There is an opportunity sometimes to give those orders, and there's an opportunity not to. And so it really is in reaction to the mood and of the crowd and how quickly these events escalate. Sometimes there's not enough time to react and give those dispersal orders, and that has happened on a number of occasions here in protests in the last several years.
And recently too?
Well, I would say I can't think of a time recently, because I know that the times that we did use chemical munitions in this last 30 days, dispersal orders were given most of the time. It may have. I would have to review all those reports to see.
Okay. So a dispersal order is given, you know, if police are at the point where they're ready to arrest, and somebody's like, okay, fine, I'm walking away. Like, they hung around until the very last second and they started walking away. Are they allowed to leave, or are they arrested?
As soon as we start marching towards them, if they turn around and walk away, they walk away. We don't chase people down unless we identify them as somebody who has committed a crime that we want for an assault or something of that nature. But if they're just generally there and we start moving after we've given the dispersal orders, if they turn around and walk away from us, they can leave all they want. If they stand their ground and we get to a point where we can reach them and touch them, then they're failing to disperse, and the chances are they're going to wind up going to jail.
Okay. And what about, there's the chemical munitions, but we also hear a lot about rubber bullets and flashbangs, which have also, both of those have been used recently. Can you speak to those?
Yes, and that's the next slides that are going to come up. We're talking about cart munitions.
Great.
Moving on.
Yes.
So what we're going to talk about now is, these are actually slides from our 2020 CART team training. And our CART team is a group of officers and supervisors that have been trained to use these munitions in a crowd control setting. Some of these munitions are used during patrol to de-escalate, like suicidals or things of that nature, persons that are emotionally disturbed. But this is specifically for use in a crowd control setting. So our main priority is the priority of life. No matter what the tactic or use of force is used, prior life is primary in consideration. So prior to deployment, what our CART team takes into consideration are several factors. One is, it sounds strange, but hostages. So if somebody is trapped into the crowd, we're worried about that. These same priority of life are also used by tactics teams and patrol officers on a daily basis on how they evaluate their use of force and what they're going to do. So number one priority is hostages. Second priority are citizens, people who are there just to observe. We don't want to have them injured in any way or taken into custody inadvertently or anything. So that's why we do the dispersal orders. The third priority would be law enforcement officers, and then our tactical officers, with the suspects being the last priority of life. Okay.
Paul, I hate to interrupt, but can you discern between CART and SWAT for us?
Yes, ma'am. So the CART team is specifically trained individuals to deal with CART munitions, which is your gas, your impact munitions, things of that nature. SWAT team are the tactical teams that you would use to rescue hostages, go to bank robberies, things of that nature. So one is specifically for crowd control, and one is specifically for tactical situations, such as the hostages and stuff.
Okay.
Okay. So it's our job to protect the public first, then the officers, then the property. That is our goal. It's always those first. So if time and circumstances permit, 2 questions must be asked prior to deployment of any CART munitions. And number one is, who's going to benefit from the munitions we are about to deploy? Are there people in immediate danger, or is it just property? Then we have to ask, what is the risk being taken versus the benefit? So risk versus reward. Are we going to put our officers or other protesters or people who are bystanders in jeopardy by using these munitions at the time? So those are questions that our guys have to ask themselves. So the CART team, the deployment of a CART team with less lethal impact munitions, which are your rubber batons that shoot out of 40 millimeters, or the distraction devices, which are what we call blast balls. They're the loud grenades, or chemical irritants, which is your OC and your CS, is effective for crowd management, for crowd dispersal, riot control, anti-looting, area denial, if we don't want them in a certain area, or force protection because we're protecting our officers. Now, how we deploy those is if it's a misdemeanor crime. So if it's misdemeanor property damage or misdemeanor assaults, then we'll use the pepper balls. And the pepper balls look like the paintball guns, and they have small balls that have a pava in it with a pepper powder in it. Now we can use those. Those are really accurate, and we can target individuals, or we can target the whole crowd by hitting the ground in front of them so the dust kicks up and affects a lot of people. It offers greater standoff so that we can shoot that out to 20, 30, 60 feet, so we don't have to get close to them. And hopefully the irritant will persuade people to leave. We can use, the OC can affect, it's in the air, so it's going to affect a lot of people. So you have to ask yourself, can I justify affecting multiple people when I shoot the OC? And so that comes down to the question of the crowd makeup and what are they doing? Are they violating a law by failing to disperse, and so on. And then the blast ball is the loud grenade that it doesn't kick out any pellets or anything like that. It just a lot of loud noise and light. But again, it's going to affect a lot of people because of the noise. So you have to ask yourself, can I justify affecting multiple people when I throw this? Now, one thing it does offer is standoff, because we can throw it, and then it's effective for dispersing a crowd, because we've all seen the videos of when the blast ball goes off, people run from it. Now, felony level crime for property damage and felony assault, and then in your riots, we can use the pepper ball. And this is now where we can start introducing the OC and the CS gas to disperse. So now we're talking about the major damage to property or major assaults to individuals. We're not talking pushing and shoving kind of things. We're talking about people who are going to become seriously injured on it. So now I can use the gas, or I can use the blast ball. And then we have what we call a sting ball, which is a blast ball that has little pellets in it, and it does exactly like it sounds. When you throw it out, it goes off. These rubber pellets will go out, and it actually stings. And so now we're hoping that the little bit of pain compliance will get people to leave the area. We have what they call the 40 millimeter blue nose, and we shoot those out of launchers, and we can target individuals. Now, we use those if we see somebody with a rock and say that they're about ready to throw it, and they cock their arm back, and we can shoot them with the 40 millimeter. It's a foam projectile, so it's a less lethal munition, and we aim for the waistline and below, trying to hit them more in the stomach area and down, so that we can try to stop them. Now, our whole goal is we want to get those people into custody if we're using those. Then we have what we call the rubber batons and 60 caliber rubber balls, which also fire out of the launchers, and we skip those into the crowd, and they can hit the legs of individuals. And again, we're hoping to sting them so that they don't want to be in the area anymore. The whole goal is to get people out of the area and stop their behavior from occurring. And again, so we have to ask ourselves, again, can I justify hitting multiple people, and was dispersal orders given so people have the time to get out of the area? Now, sometimes, like we discussed, we might have to react so fast that we can't give a dispersal order. But as soon as we secure the immediate area, our guys are trained to stop, and then we immediately start giving dispersal orders as soon as feasible on that.
Did I hear you correctly that some of these are used for dispersing a crowd and some of them are used to try to arrest somebody?
Anytime if I use what we call a direct impact, meaning I shoot you directly with like a 40 millimeter blue nose, my goal is to try to take you into custody. It's to first stop your assaultive behavior, and then to get you into custody. We have some that have powder in them, the green nose, that actually will mark the person. So it'll actually stop their assaultive behavior and mark them so that we can hopefully get them into custody on that. So again, it depends on the makeup of the crowd. Our personnel that we have being able to form what we call an arrest team that can now penetrate into the crowd to grab that person and take them into custody.
Okay.
So it's just a method to mark them.
It's a method to stop their aggressive behavior and mark them both. So
I just have to say, like, I'm still feeling very confused about when something becomes a riot. And my concern is that if that is a call that is made very quickly, and it's determined that a dispersal order is not, there's no time to give that, there's no time for people to get away, you might have a crowd of many, many people who are there to express their First Amendment rights, to join in protest, to be in community with one another, who then are subject to these tactics. And so it just seems very unclear to me. And of course, I don't have all of the training that you all do, but hearing some of the stories, especially from the May 31st and June 1st protests, and how quickly those were escalated with some of these tactics, and hearing from some of the people who were impacted by them, it's very concerning to me.
Thank you.
So one of the things our CART officers have to do is they make the deployment decision. So this is how they make decisions if they're going to launch these munitions. They have to get eyes on the crowd. They need to determine, is the action lawful or unlawful? Are people masked up, armed? Is there property damage or assault? What's the crowd makeup? If there's children in the crowd, then it severely limits what we can do. If there's elderly in the crowd, it severely limits what we can do, because we're not going to put those individuals at risk of these types of munitions, okay? And so we have to ask ourselves, do I have the tools to actually be able to intervene at this time? So, and that's why it may take some time before we can do anything, because we have to have the right personnel and the right time to intervene. We have to ask, what's the subject under arrest for if we deploy these munitions? So we got to have a crime. We can't just willy-nilly throw things out there just to make people go away. We have to have a crime. Failure to disperse, they have to be assaulting people or breaking property. So at no time do we ever just want people to go away and start throwing this stuff. We have to ask, can I effect an arrest if the subjects don't run? So if the subject stays, can I actually send an arrest team out there to get this individual? Because that's our goal, is if we have to use these munitions, is actually to get them a person under arrest. But as you know, you've seen, people tend to move pretty quick to clear the area, which is one of our major goals, but it's also to try to get these individuals out of that crowd so that we can separate them from those peaceful protesters that want to be there, and that are putting them at risk. We have to ask, can I prevent property damage or assaults? And again, is it worth it? Is the risk versus the reward? We have to ask if it's safe to intervene. Are we going to put our officers or other people at risk if we intervene? And again, before we do anything, we have to make sure that the crowd has a place to go. We don't box them in. We allow them places to leave, whether to go north, south, east, or west. They have a place to go.
You mentioned assessing the crowd as to whether there's children or elders, but I'm also curious of, and how would you know if there were people with sensitive conditions, asthma, sensitive lung conditions, sensory sensitivity?
You won't. You wouldn't know that. You couldn't know that any more than if you were walking in the mall and could see if anybody in the mall had it, unfortunately. Now, if we see somebody say that they are walking with an oxygen tank, of course, that's obvious. But this day and age with COVID and everybody's masked up, it's hard to delineate those people out there. That's why we try to give the dispersal orders as many times as we can. So hopefully those people that are participating will leave and not be subject to any arrests.
All right, I'm getting some questions from council members. We had allotted an hour and a half for the study session. We're now at almost 2 hours.
Yes.
So I know you've been handling a lot of questions, so I just want to be sensitive to time for staff as well. So if we can keep moving through the conversation, that would be great.
So again, with CART members, some of the things we have to ask ourselves is it a planned event? If it's a planned event, it's easier to manage. Are we going to be using traditional skirmish line? If we are, then the CART team needs to stay behind that line. And it's the hard troops, again, the guys with the helmets and the body armor on, that will be making the arrest. And our goal as the CART team is to protect, force protection, make sure our officers don't get hurt by anybody who is hurling things or causing fires or things of that nature. We encourage our officers to blend making their own decisions with their leaders, the CART leaders and stuff. And again, we talk about being flexible. We communicate with the team leaders. We encourage our officers to don't be afraid to take control in an emergency. So we don't want our guys just to go running by themselves to grab somebody. But we don't want them to be fearful if they have to grab somebody that's real close, that they can take control. And there's lots of experience with our officers that we encourage them to help our supervisors make decisions based on their experience. And this is where the class would have a discussion on what role the CART team members have in these situations. I'm going to be just moving kind of quick for your time here. So types of deployments, the teams are usually mobile. If they're mobile, then the purpose is to be out there to monitor the crowd and respond immediately. Again, these are the CART members, not the guys who are wearing all the armor and stuff. They're there to make sure to try to stop any property damage or assaults if they see it right away. Okay, and this might be one of those ones where we don't have the time to give a dispersal order because we come around the corner and we see somebody maybe being assaulted. We encourage our team leaders of the CART teams to take the lead, and we are going to be doing force protection for the bike officers and the officers on foot. CART bike officers, sometimes the bike officers might have pepper balls with them or OC spray, but they'll never have any of the hand-thrown munitions and things of that nature. Okay, so this is a form and how we evaluate the risk of protests. This is something that goes through our chain of command, and this is when somebody wants to plan an event with us, and it's a risk assessment that we do. It talks about the event details. It talks about what information we receive through open source, like social media, posters, banners, and the cooperation and safety factors. And then it basically gives us a matrix to add some scoring criteria to determine how we deploy forces for certain events. So that might be something that you can discuss with the chief a little bit later on how we deploy the forces for the events. So now we're on to some questions. So these were some questions that were given to us that we try to answer for you the best we can, okay? So what investigations are done before a planned event? So we have a crime analyst here who looks through open source materials. So again, posters, social media, things of that nature for materials, anything that's open to the public for materials regarding upcoming protests. We also consider what groups are involved, if they're named, and their previous history of being violent or non-violent. So that's how we start planning for the event. We asked, the question was asked of what behaviors are monitored in a crowd to identify potential threats. So one of the things we do is officers look for potential weapons such as bats or poles, heavy backpacks, because they'll actually bring rocks and bottles in backpacks. Are they armored up or shielded? Are they wearing helmets or things underneath their clothing, spray paint, individuals participating in active violence or assault? So those are things that we're looking for when we're monitoring the crowds.
I assume this would include guns. I'm just surprised to not see guns specifically listed there.
Yes, it would include guns. Guns are a high priority for us if we see someone in the crowd that is open carrying. But open carrying is not against the law, so we can't just arbitrarily pull them out of the crowd, but we do identify them, and they do draw a lot of interest for us to keep an eye on them to make sure that it does not become a situation in the crowd. Okay.
How about skateboards?
Skateboards, we take those into consideration too. I've seen multiple videos of windshields getting bashed out with skateboards and things of that nature. So while it is a form of transportation, it's not illegal to have. Depending on how it is used in a protest, could become illegal. So we keep an eye on that, and our officers just identify. If nothing occurs, then of course we take no action. So another question was, how does OPD distinguish when crowd becomes a riot, and how is it decided to switch from crowd intervention to tactical control? And again, it comes back to when multiple instances of assault or property damage occurs, then the assembly is declared unlawful, and we give the warning announcements that are made. Hopefully the people who are not involved with the property damage or the assaults will leave, and therefore what we're left over with are the people that are causing unlawful acts and that we have to take action with. So again, part of this goes back to the public, that if they don't want to be arrested or have any kind of munitions used against them, they should follow the advice of the announcements and dispersal orders, and they should leave the area, because there's possibility that we could take action, and they may inadvertently be involved in that. So the question was, when multiple incidents of assault or property damage occur, the assembly is declared unlawful and warning announcements are made. So I looked up May Day 2017 incidents, which was referenced in the training materials. There was a clear point when OPD declared a riot, as seen on Twitter posts, and changed tactics. What led to these decisions? So the answers on that we were able to give for you was that the warnings were given to prevent further assaults or property damage, and to give peaceful members of the crowd notice and opportunity to leave so the violent individuals could be stopped. Okay, that's the first part. The May 2017, in 2017, individuals in the group assaulted bystanders and were shooting marbles at officers with wrist rockets. And if you don't know what a wrist rocket is, it's a slingshot that uses a surgical tube, and those things can actually launch projectiles up to 265 feet per second. So that can cause serious physical injury to somebody if it was to get hit in the face with it. That's the reason why you saw in 2017 tactics dramatically change in that instance. So in one of the training documents, maintain peace is identified as a goal, but none of the actions in the training have the intent to help the crowd maintain peace. This is kind of a tough one, because we don't maintain crowd peace. This would involve officers getting into the crowd, potentially escalating the crowd and putting officers at risk. It's the crowd that needs to maintain the peace. And to maintain the peace, the officers, what we do is we stay at a distance. We conduct traffic control for the safety of the crowd and the drivers to prevent conflicts between the groups or uninvolved parties, because we don't want to see a vehicle get trapped in the crowd and you have, you know, those things we've seen on the videos where somebody steps on the gas and something bad happens. So we try to protect the crowd as much as possible when they're marching around and maintain our distance. We do not intervene in a protest until there is property damage or assaults. At this time, we declare the assembly unlawful, and when it's safe to do so, we attempt to take the responsible individuals into custody or disperse the crowd so that they're no longer there.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah. What if you had two protests occurring at simultaneously, one that is relatively peaceful and one that has weapons, whatever? And the one that has weapons or deemed to be weapons is approaching the peaceful crowd, and it appears, just based on the fact that they're holding the weapon up in front of them, open carry, would you allow these crowds to make contact with each other?
Again, that's one where we're going to have to determine whether or not we have the resources to send officers in there to either separate the crowd so that they don't become a conflict. But to be honest with you, the Olympia Police Department is only so big, and that we can only field so many officers to if you had two crowds of 100 each, trying to separate those with the resources we have would be very, very difficult for us. And so it may seem that we're slow to react, and it's because we're trying to get resources to get in there. So unfortunately, those things evolve very quickly. And it may seem that we are taking our time, and we are, because we don't want to get our officers hurt as much as we don't want people to get hurt.
Hey, Paul, can I add into that a little bit?
Yes, yes, sir.
Ideally, if we have two groups that we know have different ideologies that have a potential for conflict and there may be firearms involved, we'll try to reach out to that group and discourage them from having contact with the other group. That's something that we've done regularly. And I think it's important that we'll continue to do that, is to kind of discourage those folks from coming together and having those interactions, because we know that those interactions have been heated as of recent. We've seen that in the last 30 days. So it's in our best interest to continue to try to make sure we facilitate a safe space for both of those groups. We're not always successful in doing that, but that's our desire to do that, and we'll continue to try to reach out do that work.
I'd like to ask a question about that final bullet point on the last slide. The way that that's framed, it sounds like if you've got a protest of 100 people and one person damages property, the whole thing gets dispersed. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. That would be, go back to our example of a nonviolent protest with a trouble in it.
Okay.
And then we would try to pull them from the crowd if we possibly could.
Okay. Yeah, I just read that and it seemed to be in conflict with what you said before. So I just wanted to check in on that.
Okay. So again, we had what could be incorporated into this training for crowd control de-escalation, or a deliberate effort from police to limit their impacts on escalation. So right now we attempt to interact with anti-law enforcement or hostile protesters as little as possible in an attempt to reduce an opportunity for conflict. We provide traffic control for the safety of all involved, and we provide officers on bike to escort and move ahead the protester to clear and prevent traffic impacts. When possible, we dress soft, not in riot equipment, if it's at all possible. And then we stage officers in riot equipment and cart teams out of the area until a protest is deemed unlawful. So the biggest thing that we try to do is try to basically give them their space and try to make it as safe as possible for them, especially if they're anti-law enforcement for us, because we don't want to escalate it.
Sergeant Evers, could
Sir.
you speak to the May 30th, June 1st evenings, and that the hard troops lined up early on in that in those protests? This sounds different from what I experienced on that Sunday and Monday night. So was that because of assessments you'd done earlier on, or is this a shift in tactics across this month?
I can respond to that from a command standpoint, because most of those operations are planned by a lieutenant or above. And so typically how we staff and how we deploy is based on the information that we have. In these events, we expected to have issues based on some of the information that we had available to us. We knew in the past that we'd had some problems with some of those groups that were folks that were infiltrating some of these peaceful marches and in breaking windows, and we expected that to happen. What we learned was, and one of the things we talk about, the importance of changing tactics through de-escalation is one of the things that you saw, the second or third day into this, we recognized that we were a catalyst for folks when we were dressed, particularly in hard gear, in what we call our riot control suits. That was an escalator for our community, and understandably, we were a point of focus for these protests, and having officers visible, particularly in the hard gear, was not helping. And so I think it's important to note that we try to base our planning off of past experiences, and those, this is not exact science. Not every time you add this to this, you're going to get the same product. It's different every time. The important thing is that we're nimble and that we're fluid and we can adjust, and I think that's important for us to continue to learn from these events. These are different than we've ever experienced. The level of interest in police and reform and is different than we've ever experienced in my career, and so we need to adapt, and we need to adapt to the needs of our community in how we address these type of events. And we did that, and I will tell you that, and I think Sergeant Evers mentioned it earlier, we're not always going to get it perfect. We're going to try. And we need to be willing to change and to adapt. And I think that's what happened here. So you did see hard troops out in the beginning, in those first 2 days. That second day, it was very violent, and it went south very quickly. But we recognized, I think there was an escalator there of having those hard troops out there. So it's based on the information that we had in the pre-planning, and a lot of it, in that pre-planning matrix that we talked about, it's things like, does the group communicate with police beforehand. That's something in the past, most of our groups during protests and demonstrations would communicate. Across the nation, protests are much less organized. Folks are much less apt to communicate with police, and it makes it really difficult to plan for these events. So we rely on things that are in social media. We rely on posters that are posted around town. And sometimes those things that we see posted don't represent the vast majority of the community that wants to come out and have a voice. But it's hard to read that. And so we just kind of have to, as we move along, kind of consistently evaluate those crowds. And we need to adjust with the mood of the crowd. As that mood changes, we need to escalate as far as how we address those crowds. We may have misjudged it, and we need to back off and pull people back in. And so it's the yin and the yang. It's a constant evaluation and willingness to be fluid and nimble. I think that's important for us to note that we're going to continue to try to get those things right. But it's a challenge. There's no correct science to this whole thing. So,
thank you, Chief.
Can I follow up on that? Just Chief, so did you, when tactics changed, did the CART deployment guidelines change, or were the same guidelines in place throughout the last month? Because I can see how, from some perceptions of watching the videos, it doesn't match the questions you showed for CART deployment on the first slide. Like they don't appear to have been answered correctly to me. And so what will be involved in retraining and so we can make sure that doesn't happen again?
I'm not sure. Can you give me some more clarity on your question? I'm not sure I'm following you totally.
So the first CART so all these slides about CART deployment guidelines, did they change when you changed tactics, or was it the same guideline on the 1st of June or of July as it is today?
So there was a change in CART deployment, and the change in CART deployment was a result of the resolution that was passed. So as you know, that the resolution restricting chemical weapons.
But that was after the tactical change you just described a few minutes ago, and the hard gear and the line, and so like I don't feel like those questions were answered, and it's really hard for me to say to you in public without saying to you privately. But seeing those questions doesn't with the events of those 2 nights that everyone's bringing up, and I want to know what we're going to do about it.
Yeah, I think, we can have further discussions about this, and I'm willing to do that. I think it's important that we evaluate each one of these uses of force. The Monday night event was the last night we had utilized any type of CART when it comes to irritants. Tuesday was the council meeting, and there was a resolution passed on Tuesday. And after that point, there was a restrictive use of irritants. So I'm not sure at which point you're talking about whether they changed or didn't change, or if you're referring to the Sunday or the Monday events that you're talking about. So I think maybe a further discussion about this offline. We could probably I can maybe more clarify and understand your question. So I think
yeah, that would be great, and I think it would be really helpful for the council to get the reports on those 2 nights not embedded in a 500-page document. So I want to see that with the use of force and the CART deployment guidelines laid over it, because that's where I have questions. Like you responded well as a department to the community, but I still don't understand why we were where we were on those 2 nights.
And I think that having further discussions, and I think it's important to note too that it's a different view, and it's from a video or from the back of a protest, and I want to make sure that everybody recognizes this, is that it's very different than being on the front line, and you see different things. And so I think it's important to have these discussions and talk about those instances, and maybe sit down and dissect each one of those and walk through and overlay those. I think it's a great idea, and kind of match this up to see, okay, how did we do? Did we perform in a way that our policies and our procedures dictated that we performed? I'm really open to that, and those are discussions that I think we should have, because we're accountable for each use of force. And so I'm open to doing that with you in the next coming week.
Chief, I've got a quick follow-up very related to that. The Washington State Patrol decided that they're not using tear gas, at least through the pandemic and until further notice is what they've said. Has there been any conversation with the State Patrol on how they've changed their tactics after that they imposed that on themselves?
I don't know the details behind that totally, whether or not that's restricted to all uses of that. I know that when Seattle initially did their ban on that, it was not a complete restriction of that. It still allowed for the use of those when there was life-threatening behavior, significant property damage. So I'm not sure whether the State Patrol is in line with Seattle's or not, so I really can't answer that question.
And I bring it up to say, like, it'd be good to loop, as these conversations continue, to figure out how Washington State Patrol is changing their practices, knowing the threat involved with using tear gas and other chemical irritants.
So Danny, you know what I would say? I would say that the Washington State Patrol is not dealing with the kind of situations that we are in Olympia right now. They basically blocked off the Capitol campus completely with concrete barriers. They're not dealing with what we're dealing with.
Mayor, I agree with you, but I also think that they likely want to be prepared to deal with damage to state property.
Yeah, I think we'll look into that. I think that, thank you for bringing that up, and I'll make sure I look into that and see how they're handling that.
All right, so I'd like to know for point of like process here, we're almost 2.5 hours in. And so I want to know how many more slides we have and if we can wrap this up quickly with council.
We're there. I think we can start giving you some more questions. We're done with slides.
Okay. All right, and then I got some closing comments.
I got one question.
Okay.
And it goes to Councilmember Cooper's and the Chief's agreement to look at and overlay what happened Sunday and Monday with what our policies are. I would encourage us to do this in a very transparent way, because that allows the community to see us actually trying to learn from something, as well as not hiding where we could have done something better. I think that's what the community is looking for us to do, is to be transparent in these questions. So if we can manage that, that's all I would ask, is don't just do it with individual council members, but find a way to do it in a manner that we can be transparent to the community and show that we're trying to learn and be better in our processes.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else?
I have a real quick question.
Okay.
I know we're going to be doing a lot more conversations, and with our new Human Rights Commission, this is the beginning of conversations, and I appreciate the transparency and the new updated page that we have for folks that have questions about this.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. One last question from a constituent. So are police officers prohibited from providing or rendering aid if they do not have a weapon on them?
No.
So they can,
but a police officer is going to have a weapon on them while on duty. So I'm not sure at all times. That's part of the uniform.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other questions? I got Clark.
Thank you. I think it would be important to at least briefly address the smash and runs through downtown the last few days, because for all of these tactics, it must be very difficult to intervene in an unscheduled, some point during the night, 10-minute run. So I'm wondering, how do these tactics change the number of broken windows in our town? So,
I want to just say to begin with that I completely denounce this behavior. It's unacceptable. It takes away from who we are as a community. And from a police department's perspective, we will not tolerate this, and we will hold people accountable if we can find the folks that are doing these actions. I just want to say that because this community deserves more than they're getting, and it's sickening. The other part of this is that our tactics are changing. We're recognizing that this group is coming out in the middle of the night, off hours. They're there at a very short period of time. They covertly come in and they cause a great deal of damage. So we are bringing in extra staff. We're going to have extra staff that are roaming the city, both downtown, west side, east side, on prime targets. We have reached out to regional partners to get their assistance in doing this, because from a staffing standpoint, a fatigue management standpoint, it's almost unsustainable at this point. We're now in over 30 days of having staff in on their days off and working long hours. And so we're really relying on our regional partners to help us do this. But we will have extra staff out every night to try to quickly address these issues. That is the best that we can do at this point, and we will proactively look at investigating these cases from a digital evidence standpoint as well. So my hope is that we can hold people accountable for their actions. So that's what you can expect from the police department as far as trying to address these smash and grab type things.
Thank you. Any other questions for Aaron or his team at this point? All right, I just want to wrap up with some comments. I want to thank Aaron and his team at OPD for what you have been through these last 30 days. And I know at times we've held your feet to the fire as a department, but I think that's going to get us through this in a better place. I also want to call out for our community that's listening that our website has been updated, and Aaron went through that last night. And so we are going to overcompensate in the effort of transparency. Our whole police budget is up there, all these training protocols, everything that you can imagine is available for our community to understand about our police department. And if there's something that's not there, ask us and we will put it up there. And then I also want to just acknowledge that we're all, as council members, as elected officials, as our staff at the city and the police department, we're all in a rock and a hard place right now. It feels like no matter which way we pivot, somebody's going to be upset with us right now. And that's just, it's part of the role of being leaders in our community, and we take it on. But I just want to acknowledge that these are tough times. We have 3 crises that we're dealing with at this point. We had a homelessness crisis going into this COVID global pandemic, and now we have the 400 years of racial injustice that are overlaid on that. And then we have just a very discordant conversation at the national level. People are driven to extremes now, and it's not being helped by the national narrative that's coming out of DC. We need to be better as a community, and I have faith that we can do that. You covered the art and the science of crowd control. There's no way that we as council members can second guess what you guys are experiencing out in the field. So I appreciate you tonight giving us your best overlay of what you look at through your lenses that we can't see. I also want to acknowledge that we put out a statement this evening a couple hours ago commenting on the recent events from the city. I want to send people to the city's Facebook page for that. But I also want to close with a comment about personal responsibility. And I've been in marches, and I've been on the perimeter of protests. And if you were in one of these situations and you feel you have to take some personal responsibility, do you want to be in that moment where things could go wrong? Things are going wrong. Take some personal responsibility. Get yourself out of there, because things are different now. This last 30 days and the last 2 weeks especially, things are different. And there's groups out there on both sides of the political spectrum that want to cause problems. Find the peaceful protests. Look for the ones that say family friendly. Go out, make your voices heard. We need to hear from people, but these actions that are happening now are not ones that you want to be involved in. You certainly do not want to associate the Black Lives Matter movement with these actions that are happening. So I'm sounding a little bit strong right now, but I want to give it up to the Olympia Police Department. For a city our size, we take on just an amazing amount of community actions, and we've all been through a lot right now. I want to thank this council for holding strong. We've got 4 public town halls on racial justice. I want everybody to know about those as well, but that's the conversation that I want to move forward. That's the conversation I want to elevate, is how we can make our our Black, Indigenous, people of color feel safe and welcome in our community. And the rest of this stuff is useless noise that these other people are doing out there. We need to elevate those voices and bring our community forward and our business owners forward out of this crisis, these multiple crises. So that's my soapbox for the evening.
Can I
oh,
go ahead, Lisa?
I was actually going to ask for Renata.
Well, everyone
or someone
said
from
no, and that
General-
was the closing comment.
I was going to say that was my closing comment, but okay, really briefly, Lisa.
Point of information, when is the general government meeting that's going to be discussing the Human Rights Commission and the police auditor? Just what date it is for the community that's listening. Don't go
July
into
22nd.
it, just so they know.
July 22nd. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm thinking that we've probably been through enough for this evening. Renata, do you have something brief?
I don't have other questions. You asked about questions, and I just had some closing thoughts as well. Okay. And I guess, first of all, I want to say I understand it's been a long session, but this is really important, and I don't think it's right for me or any of us to feel like we need to cut our thoughts short for the purpose of being transparent to the public. I really don't have much to say other than I think a question of the community. You know, we had a lot of support basically the first couple weeks into July to really reimagine public safety and rethink our police budget and look at demands like divesting, as well as a lot of unity around wanting to make sure that armed vigilantes weren't welcome. And that I felt was really encouraging. And that's obviously been a little bit more shaky over the past week with the actions of, as someone else called it, kind of the smash and go. So my question to the community, and particularly movement activists who are on the ground, is how can the city support the community and the movement in reimagining what a response might look like to the last few days that's not militarized, that's not police-based? How do we empower people in the movement who do see the damage caused by what appears to be just senseless vandalism without a lot of strategy involved? I think that there's a lot of potential there when we're talking about reimagining public safety. This and community care. Here's a case in point to do that. I understand the city and the police resources have a certain angle on it, but what would the community like to see? And that's worth considering. I guess my final thought is, I think, a lot of these slides portray a very clear, like oh, if this then this, if this then this, but that hasn't been my experience being on the ground. And so I know it's hard work, but as Jelsik said, it's not an exact science, and we need more community voices contributing to how we can deal with these in non-violent, non-escalatory responses. Otherwise, I mean, we have to evolve beyond might meets right at some point.
All right. Again, thanks everybody for your patience getting through this evening. More to come, like I said. So stay tuned. Please check out our city website. Any way you want to get involved with all of our forward-moving policies, that's where you'll find out about it. So with that, I'm going to say good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Chief.